All right, at this time, I am going to pass the mic over to our presenter today, Michelle. Michelle, go ahead.
Thanks, Emily. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you all today, this afternoon, to talk about one of my passion projects in life, and that's accessible hiking and the accessible and inclusive hiking experience. My name is Michelle Cook. I am the inclusive design specialist with Access Smithsonian, and I know several of the participants on today's call may have also encountered me as a former employee of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. It is my absolute pleasure to be back with this audience and engaging with you in this meaningful way. So today we're going to talk about the inclusive hiking experience and what it means for designers, managers, users, advocates, to really have a grasp on that opportunity that should be available readily to everyone to benefit from. Slide 12. The great outdoors. So I'm going to start with this iconic meme from the internet that I generated for the purpose of this presentation, but it's the gentleman sitting behind a table in an outdoor setting, holding up a mug, and his sign that's taped to the table says, "Everyone benefits from being in nature, change my mind." So time spent in nature improves health and well-being. We know this to be true, not only because that it might be something we have experienced for ourselves or with groups that we are affiliated with, or our families or our friends, but also there's the research to back it up. So some of the proven benefits of the great outdoors include decreased stress, relaxed muscle tension, reduced heart rate and cortisol levels, bolstered connectedness with self, surroundings, and community, and even increased empathy. And man, couldn't we use a little bit of that from time to time? So accessing the great outdoors and being outside is just really beneficial for a number of physical, emotional, social, and mental health reasons. So we want to make sure that those opportunities are available for all audiences. I also want to present my working definition of inclusion. Now, this is something that has evolved for me over the years as I learn more about the community of people with disabilities. I learn more about design. I learn more about recreation. So this is a working definition, but one that I stick to wholeheartedly. So the inclusion of people with disabilities into everyday activities involves the thoughtful embodiment of practices and policies designed to identify, anticipate, and remove barriers such as physical, communication, and attitudinal that hamper the ability for full participation and enjoyment of the lived experience. So when we're talking about trails or the inclusive hiking experience, the access to the inclusive outdoor environment, all of those things come into play, right? Practices of how we maintain those trails, policies on who we allow on the trails and with what supports, removing those barriers that are physical in nature by altering the physical environment in whatever ways we can within certain constraints, certainly. Communicating information about the trail and about its amenities or about the outdoor experience and the things that are in the surrounding areas to contribute to that experience. And then ultimately keeping that idea of participation, active participation in that experience and enjoyment of that experience at the forefront of everything that we're doing to support access to the outdoors and hiking. So the inclusive hiking experience might involve several of these items that are listed on your screen. For me, an inclusively designed hiking experience allows for challenge and or engagement by choice. So there's enough information being provided about the experience up front to allow an individual to know themselves and their abilities well enough to take that challenge or to engage with that experience or that area by choice, by what is right for them. So there's, again, that enough information is being provided in an objective way that's meaningfully communicated in an accessible way to the widest audience possible to allow for that choice. And also accessible amenities, things like parking areas, your arrival zones, your drop-off zones, personal care features, restrooms and the like, water fountains, other facilities, whether there's a visitor center in the area or the hike is connected to some other facility. There's a playground nearby. All of those things that we know from the recreation standards and other areas of the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Architectural Barriers Act, that those amenities that are provided around that hiking experience are also accessible to those users, to all users. Intuitive maps and orientation. So knowing ahead of time and then also maybe while you're on the trail or within the outdoor environment, knowing where you are and how to return from where you came from, right? To get back to your car, have the opportunity to access the closest seating area or the closest picnic area, restrooms, other facilities that are indicated on the map, or if it happens to be an interpretive trail, where's the next sign? Where am I going to find that next tree that is that is going to be interpreted for me, or what have you? And then also integrated rest and recharge locations. This is absolutely key for prolonged exposure to the outdoors so that we can get into an outdoor environment and not simply move throughout space and say, that was nice, and go home, but really be able to stay in that space for a prolonged time. So having opportunities for rest and recharge benches or seating areas or pavilions along the trail or what have you, it'll look different depending on what the experience is overall. But that opportunity for rest and recharge will prolong that exposure to an outdoor environment and only increase those health benefits that we talked about earlier. So also part of the inclusive hiking experience might be some universally designed learning or interpretation opportunities. So the information that we're providing about the great outdoors or about what happened to be in this physical space, this natural environment long ago, whether it's a history lesson or a lesson on nature or what have you, that information is also designed in such a way to be universally accessible to the widest amount of users possible. So the information on signage, is that available also in electronic format? Are there opportunities for tactile exploration and multi-sensory engagement with the surroundings or with the story? There's those opportunities to engage at multiple levels of interaction and learning. And then the last one I think that often gets overlooked, at least from a facility management standpoint, are safety supports and emergency responsiveness. One of the barriers to getting out in nature is a perception of threat in some way, whether it's to self or might encounter a particular animal or something else that is hazardous in the environment. That there are those things that are communicated about those anticipated or expected threats that are easily overcome. Right, so that if there is an emergency along a trail, that the land manager or the recreation department that experience is connected to has made those connections within the community to support their users by anticipating their emergency needs in that type of situation. So whether it be a heat-related illness or something like that. That those kinds of safety supports and responsiveness policies exist to support that full inclusive user experience and break down those barriers. So speaking about the ADA and the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center and its role within the ADA National Network, there are also legislative requirements when it comes to the inclusive experience of hiking and other recreation opportunities as well But when we're specifically talking, about hiking, there is a particular part of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehab Act that particularly pertains to this idea of experience. So far, I haven't used a lot of legalese in terms of what we're talking about in terms of inclusion, because inclusion really gets at this idea of program access, and it's a much more approachable, universal way of looking at that experience as a whole. So what program access in the ADA and also Section 504 of the Rehab Act says essentially is that each facility or part of a facility constructed by or on behalf of or for the use of a federal or public entity shall be designed and constructed in such a manner that the facility or part of the facility is readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. Now that's the technical terminology, right? These are the things that we know from Section 504, from Title II of the ADA. This is our legal mandate for facilities, right? But here's the question. Services, programs, and activities, when viewed in their entirety from a public entity, must be readily accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities. But is hiking or a trail system considered a service, program, or activity? Absolutely yes. Okay, so trails and the idea of hiking, this is a service. It is an activity that is being afforded for the benefit of the public, of all people. So it would be a covered service by that entity. So what resources exist to support that inclusive hiking experience? We know it's an experience that needs to be provided in an accessible, usable, approachable, and inclusive manner. So what resources exist? Well, I'm certainly glad you asked. So there are standards and different best practices and resources out there for accessible design. One of the first ones that all of us will very naturally gravitate towards is the Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines, or the ADA, most recently updated in 2010. An additional piece of legislation called the Architectural Barriers Act Accessibility Standards, or the ABA, was most recently updated in 2013 to include something called the Outdoor Developed Areas Accessibility Guidelines. So these and the names of the different routes are provided on the slide here too. So accessible routes are the default. That's the baseline for any type of accessible pathway, is an accessible route. You will find standards for accessible routes in both the ADA and the ABA. And the ABA simply builds on top of this idea of an accessible route and what that means to provide an accessible route by expanding that definition and applying different types of parameters for routes in the outdoors specifically. So those being outdoor recreation access routes, beach access routes, and trails. So those are covered under the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards, which are enforceable for federal entities, best practice for meeting the program access obligation for all other entities, right? So accessible trail design is not specifically addressed by the 2010 ADA standards. But going back to the previous couple of slides that we just talked about, it's trails and hiking is still a program, service, or activity, so we have to provide it in an accessible way. Well, how? By looking to the ABA, right? So these trails and other outdoor routes are addressed by the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards. They cover outdoor constructed features, including picnic tables and fire rings, trails, camping and beach access. Again, currently these standards apply only on federal lands, not on private lands or state and local lands. However, even though the ABA standards may not apply to an ADA covered facility, the ADA requires state and local governments to provide program access and public accommodations to remove barriers. So there's your Title II and Title III obligations. All covered entities are required to maintain accessible features. So the ADA's general provisions prohibiting discriminations will apply, even though the trail provider may not have to comply with every little detail about the Architectural Barriers Act standards. When there are no applicable ADA standards for design, construction, or maintenance, what the Department of Justice says is that ADA covered entities must still ensure that full and equal enjoyment of the program, services, and facilities offered. So that's where we're turning to the ABA for that guidance on accessible and inclusive trail design. It's also worth mentioning that in development currently are standards for public rights of way that includes shared use paths. So we'll get a little bit more into definitions here in a little bit. It's very important to know what type of pathway you're working with. And simply because a route is in an outdoor environment doesn't mean that everything outside is a trail. It doesn't mean that everything outside is only an accessible route. It might be one or the other or both in certain applications. What's important to know is there are different standards and design considerations for each type of route. That's what's important to know. And those accessible routes, outdoor recreation access routes, beach access routes, trails, and shared use paths all vary by the width, the running and cross slope, changes in level or obstacles, openings, resting intervals or passing spaces, protruding objects, and surface materials. And I apologize, I realized I got away from announcing the slide numbers. We are now on slide 19. So running and cross slope is an important concept to understand. Running slope is the steepness of a particular section of a pathway. Cross slope is side to side. Think about any time you've experienced a grocery cart with a wonky wheel and having to push one side a little bit harder than the other to keep it going in a straight line. That's cross slope. Changes in level or obstacles, they're called different things in the standards. It means the same thing, a change in the dimension between one surface and another, or within a pathway itself. Any type of tripping hazard is going to be considered that change in level or obstacle. Openings are the things that we're talking about, like between different surfaces, like divots or holes, or the openings between brick pavers in a pathway, or between boards on a boardwalk. Those are openings. Resting intervals and passing spaces allow for that rest and recharge integrated within the trail design itself, as well as for multiple users to pass each other, so that somebody can take a rest on the trail and the rest of their party can continue on and they can catch up later, or two directional traffic, what have you. There's all types of dimensions for those types of things. Protruding objects are those things in the environment that might be undetectable by somebody using a white cane, or someone with low vision or who's blind. Protruding objects in the built environment are very, very clearly defined. Protruding objects in the outdoors are less so. There is a certain level of expectation in an outdoor environment that it's going to be a natural space, right? So things like low-hanging branches or overgrown shrubberies are not necessarily specifically addressed by the design standards for accessibility, but they certainly have an impact on the user experience. So there's something to pay attention to in terms of access. Surface materials, from a built environment standpoint, things have to be firm, stable, and slip resistant. That's not always the case in an outdoor environment. So again, something to pay attention to there. That requirement for slip resistance generally goes away in the outdoor environment, although we never want to promote a hazardous condition. So that's another area of variation. Slide 20. So I talked about those definitions being really, really important. So from this point forward, when I'm talking about a trail, I am talking specifically about a pedestrian route only, pedestrian users only, developed primarily for outdoor recreational purposes. So, so this is a pedestrian trail. This is not a bike trail, not a horse trail, not a some other user trail, not a water trail. We're talking about pedestrian routes, and these allow for the steepest running slope without handrails in an outdoor environment. Again, there's that expectation that it's a natural space, or mostly natural space. So we want to keep that essence of that experience. Cross slope, there are exceptions based on the type of surface material that you provide, again, accounting for drainage. In an outdoor environment, things are a little bit more unpredictable. There's weather that happens outside that doesn't usually happen in an indoor environment. So there are some exceptions for that based on design and the accounting for that natural area. Passing spaces can be pretty far apart. Again, accepting that idea of it's going to be a little bit more of a challenging environment than simply walking through a built environment area like an office space or a museum. All surfaces have to be firm and stable, and trails also do allow for taller obstacles. Again, natural space, probably going to have some rocks, some roots, some twigs. Those types of things will likely be within the path in an outdoor environment, and the design guidance for accessible trails does account for that. Slide 21. Here's some key points for trail managers and advocates. So kind of to sum up, what we know about how an accessible trail is designed, and what a user can reasonably expect from an inclusively designed trail environment. So no matter what the type, surface, or type of route, make it accessible as possible. This should be a no-brainer, right? Removing barriers helps everyone. So while the trail design standards themselves say that you can go up to a certain percentage of slope, keeping those slopes as gentle and as low as possible will make that trail accessible for more users. So always design to the lowest possible slopes you can to enable for that opportunity to be accessible to the widest audience possible. Another great idea is to post proper signage and information, whether that be in the outdoor environment itself at a trailhead, for example, or an information kiosk or online, and keep it updated to allow for that individual choice based on ability, time, interest, etc. And then consider the surface materials that minimize the frequency of maintenance activities performed. The idea here is not to pave the wilderness. Keep nature wild. Provide access to accessible and inclusive natural spaces. That's what we're after, right? Is to provide that health benefit of being in nature in an accessible and inclusive way that preserves that experience for everyone. And if you're not sure where to start in terms of design or your advocacy journey, in terms of finding accessible hiking opportunities, always work to improve access to popular or unique opportunities first, and then branch out from there, right? The trail that's most used and most popular by most users is going to be the one that people with disabilities want to experience as well. The hiking experience that gets you to that really cool view of the falls or the scenery, the fall leaves, whatever it may be. Everyone wants to have an opportunity to experience that aha moment. So that's a good formula for where to start. At this point, Emily, I'm going to pause for questions, if there are any that have come in.
Yeah, there actually was just one question that came in. There have been a few others that we're able to answer, but there is one here. Is there a requirement on a trail for edge protection?
That is a fantastic question. So in terms of trail design, generally speaking, no. In terms of accessible trail design, edge protection is not specifically addressed when it comes to trails. It may be addressed in another part of the codes or standards. So, for instance, where I know a particular state's code will say that if there is a drop off of more than X inches, you have to have edge protection. And in that instance, then you would combine the two codes. You would say, okay, I know I need to provide a trail that is this wide, has this surface. Oh, this safety code that provided by the state tells me that I also need to provide edge protection. There's guidance in the ADA on what accessible edge protection looks like, while also maintaining that trail width, the surface material, the passing spaces, and all of those other factors. So it does involve a little bit of know-how in terms of design, combining what those best practices are or those other code compliance issues, and making sure that all the while that accessibility is maintained throughout that trail design. And that is a fantastic question.
We actually had a few more that came through.
Sure.
So if you don't mind, let's see. We bounce back to the chat. We've got one about the definition of a trail. I think you did talk about this, but what is the definition of a trail?
Yep, let me go back a couple of slides. Oh, just one slide.
Yep.
Slide 20 in your slide deck. The definition of a trail for accessibility reasons is a pedestrian route developed primarily for outdoor recreational purposes. That is the definition of a trail.
Great. There is a question about terrain wheelchairs. How do you feel? I'm not sure if that's a question to you. How do you feel about them, or how? Not quite sure, but it says, how do you feel on all-terrain wheelchairs?
I'm actually going to get to devices on trails in the later part of the presentation, so I'm going to hold that question.
Perfect. Let me go back to the Q&A. We've got a few more here. We can jump to somebody looking for some examples of this done really well as they want to take the information to our small local metro park system.
Oh man, that's a really great question.
Yeah, we had to think about that. Maybe we can post those later at some point.
Yeah, I would actually turn that around to the other participants on the call, the other attendees, and say, where have you experienced really good accessible trail design or inclusive trail design, and challenge your friends and neighbors to go out and have a visit to those spaces.
I love that. I love that. Maybe we can capture those too. Maybe we can grab all of those comments and post them on our website for this webinar. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. A last one here. Any comments about use of compacted gravel for trails and accessibility? Is this covered in ADA design guidance?
That is an amazing question. So compacted gravel, compacted natural surface materials can work as an accessible trail surface, as long as it meets that definition for firmness and stability. Again, because you will likely have loose fines with a natural surface trail. That's the part that where they drop the requirement for slip resistance, right? Understanding that most natural surfaces will have some of that granularity to it, and inherently not be slip resistant. So a compacted gravel surface or a hybrid surface, of some kind, can be an accessible surface if it is installed in the right way and maintained over time. So obviously something like an asphalt or a concrete, even a dyed and stamped concrete to look like a natural surface is going to have a lot of cost savings, or a lot of cost to install it up front, but long-term cost savings because it's less burdensome to maintain over time, typically. Something like a compacted gravel surface will maintain that natural aesthetic of your space, which is lovely. We want to have that wild experience. It may require a little bit more maintenance over time. Again, depending on how the initial install is done. It has been done very successfully in many, many applications. So I would encourage you to look into the research that's out there on the different trail surfaces. There's a couple of resources from the US Access Board that I could point you to, as well as the National Center on Accessibility did a trail surface study a number of years ago, but some of that data is holding up. So.
Great. All right, we had a few other questions, Michelle, but let's just pause and let you continue, and then we can get back to these after.
That sounds great. Thanks, Emily.
Yep.
All right, so getting more into the use of trails. So we talked about what goes into the design and thinking about the accessible and inclusive trail experience, but how do you know what trails are accessible for you? Great question. Great question. So there's a recipe for equity that I like to generally adhere to. Excuse me, and that's information plus choice equals quality outdoor experiences. So when you provide enough information for someone to make that informed choice about what is the right level of challenge, what's the right level of experience, they're going to have enough time to do the full thing. That's what leads to quality outdoor experiences. So in those design guidelines for accessible trails, when you're providing new signs at trailheads, there's a requirement in the ABA for what information needs to go on those signs. And this is generally considered the baseline information of what a user will need to know to make that informed choice on the type of trail that makes sense for their abilities. Again, we're on slide 24, so sorry. So that information is the length of the trail or trail segment, the type of trail surface, the typical and minimum trail tread width, so how wide it is and what's the narrowest pinch point, and then the typical and maximum trail grade or that running slope, so how steep does it get, the typical, average grade of the trail, and then the maximum, what's the steepest segment. And then the typical and maximum trail cross slope. Again, that's that wonky wheel effect with the grocery cart. So that tip side to side. That information will generally give someone, particularly someone using a mobility device, but as well as individuals, traveling in groups, or those who just want to have that informed option of, again, breaking down those perceived threats within an outdoor environment. This is good information to provide for everyone. And this, when you're providing, I want to make the distinction, when you're providing new trail signs, this information has to be provided. You can also provide this on your websites, in trail brochures, what have you. The minimum requirement is that the trailhead let somebody know what they're about to get into. There are also some noteworthy connections that you might want to make for learning more about trail access and trail access in your area, potentially. So American Trails has a really great trail accessibility hub on their website that provides lots of design resources, lots of examples of good ways to share information about trail accessibility. So I encourage you to check that out. The Rails to Trails Conservancy is also thinking very much about trail access and equity on access to trails. Their TrailLink platform does some good work in terms of providing that objective information on trails, on rail trails that are part of the Conservancy's efforts. Rail trails are also a really good place to start if you're new to the experience of hiking. They're generally wide paths, they're generally pretty level, don't have too much steepness, and they usually provide a connection from one point to another. It's usually a little bit more than just the trail itself to experience. So that's a really good way to introduce yourself or your loved ones to the idea of inclusive hiking. There's also the Outdoors for All Foundation, which has some great information online. The Everyone Outdoors movement also, and some noteworthy social media accounts that you might want to follow as well, just to put the inclusive trail and hiking experience on your radar. Disabled Hikers is a nice account to follow, Unlikely Hikers, and also Adaptive Outdoors. That's outdoors with a Z on the end. As well as your national, state, or local parks. So see what they're providing online, what information they are providing online about their trail opportunities. And those are good places to start asking some questions about trail access. Next question is, logically, what types of assistive devices can I take on a hike? Gosh, you guys asked the best questions. So wheelchairs defined any wheelchair, any device meeting the definition of a wheelchair is allowed on a trail. And I've provided the ADA definition of a wheelchair here for you. A wheelchair is a manually operated or power-driven device designed primarily for use by an individual with a mobility disability for the main purpose of indoor or of both indoor and outdoor locomotion. So that's what a wheelchair is. Any device meeting the definition of a wheelchair is allowed on trails or allowed in hiking areas. There's another type of device called an other power-driven mobility device. This is a class of devices covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act that also have a definition. There's also several assessment factors that go into determining whether or not these types of devices are appropriate for use in certain environments. So under the ADA, an other power-driven mobility device, or OPDMD, is any mobility device powered by batteries, fuel, or other engines that is used by individuals with mobility disabilities for the purpose of locomotion, including golf cars, electronic personal assistance mobility devices, such as the Segway, PT, or any mobility device designed to operate in areas without defined pedestrian routes, but that is not a wheelchair. Now, your ADA National Network has an amazing resource online for information on OPDMDs and wheelchairs. And I'm trying to copy the link, but it's not working. So it's, Emily, maybe you can type this out in the chat for me. It is adata.org/fact sheet/wheelchairs. And that is an amazing resource to come back to in understanding the definitions of these two types of mobility devices and also their applications in indoor and outdoor environments. So mobility devices on pedestrian trails, going back to that definition of a trail, primarily designed for pedestrian use for the purposes of outdoor recreation. There are some mobility devices where the answer is absolutely yes, that device is welcome on these trails. And those are manual wheelchairs, power wheelchairs, crutches, canes, braces, walkers, prosthetics, any type of mobility device or assistive device that would be allowed in an indoor environment is also allowed in an outdoor environment. Also adding on that addition of any all-terrain adaptations to any of those former devices. So a manual wheelchair, such as the one pictured here on the right-hand side of the slide, it has all-terrain bike tires. They're really thick and nubby. It has the addition of a third wheel or tricycle style wheel in the front that also provides greater maneuverability. Any type of all-terrain adaptations to a typical manual wheelchair or power wheelchair would be considered allowable on pedestrian trails. The maybe for being allowed on pedestrian trails is that other power-driven mobility device. So that is up to a little bit up to the land manager, as well as the individual with the disability to make sure that their device is meeting the criteria established by that land manager for use of certain devices in certain areas. So it may be appropriate that a land manager or state, local, national park establishes we do not allow anything that is gas powered in our outdoor environments. Okay, well, that gets rid of all of those other power driven mobility devices that are gas powered, because that poses a credible threat to the natural environment. Again, you'll find more about this in the fact sheet that I mentioned, that's provided from the ADA National Network. So that's a maybe. You got to check on the criteria there. Now, on multi-use trails, when you're talking about hiking and biking trails and stuff like that, if you're using a mobility device on a multi-use trail, slide 30, the provisions are the same as pedestrian trails, plus pay attention to the identified trail users. So for example, where bicycles are allowed on trails, hand cycles, tandem bikes, trikes, and other adaptive forms of bike-like devices would also be permitted, because you're already allowing bicycle type devices on that trail, right? So it's a managed use issue at that point. Slide 31. So in summary, in terms of the usability of a particular trail, or knowing what trail to take in the outdoors, take the trail that's meant for you. And how you determine that is by obtaining as much objective information about the trail or the hiking experience and its amenities ahead of time. So there's a note for our land managers, for our recreation managers who were on the call. Take a look at what information you are providing to users about the typical and known conditions of your trail networks to allow for that independent option for choice and challenge. If desired, you may wish to connect with organizations who promote and or host inclusive hiking events. There are lots of local chapters in the Mid-Atlantic region that do this type of work. So looking into those would be a good idea for you. And then investigate and obtain any equipment that will aid in maximizing your enjoyment in the outdoors, whether that be a good pair of shoes, hiking poles, adaptive wheels for mobility devices, you name it. What works for you, investigate what works for you, and will allow you to have that unobstructed access to those natural spaces. And Emily, we're back to you for Q&A.
All right. Well, people have definitely been putting on their thinking caps. I got some good questions here. All right. So we have one here. It says, should the use of water bars perpendicular to a trail be avoided? Should trails be 36 inches width?
Okay. Yes. So all trails, an accessible trail is 36 inches wide minimum by default. Where it needs to be wider is for passing spaces and resting intervals. There is a handout that is available on the Mid-Atlantic website for this webinar that provides a very quick look at all of those technical specifications for an accessible trail, as well as the other types of routes that I mentioned earlier in the call. That's a really quick snapshot. Instead of having to dive into the accessibility standards and try and understand a whole section, it's a nice little one-page view of what it means to design an accessible trail or accessible route or beach access route in that handout. So go ahead and refer to that. The other question attached to that, Emily, was water bars, right?
Correct.
Generally, water bars, they solve one problem, which is drainage, right? But they create another one, which is obstacles for users. So if a water bar makes sense for the particular trail that you're working on, okay. But the question then becomes, can it be maintained to be consistently accessible over time with erosion? If not, there may need to be other solutions for erosion and water control that are integrated for that particular trail, such as a culvert or a grade reversal or other types of design elements that would prevent the need for a water bar in particular.
All right, great. We got another question. This individual is planning an inclusive access trail to a popular waterfall and is met with neighborhood resistance that are concerned with that we will attract too many people, which will create traffic and parking issues. So they want your advice. Any advice you can give them about this issue and meeting a neighborhood resistance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So many thoughts, but I'm going to tackle the issue of the assumed threat to the neighborhood with the increased foot traffic and parking issues and such. This is actually an issue that I'm particularly familiar with in a former area that I used to live. A new trail was opened. There was a very small parking area at the trailhead provided within this neighborhood community. And yes, it's a very popular trail. And it was particularly overrun on the weekends with cars lining up along the roadway and blocking access to that residential area. Ultimately, what the land manager decided to do in that area was work with the community, the neighborhood community, to identify, to install proper signage that prohibited parking along the side of the roadway, to publicize times when access to the trail was less busy. And in certain peak times, they even restricted access to that trail on the weekends to weekday access only. That is only after having they only did that after having an established trend of that issue being a problem, right? There was that perception up front, but the neighborhood association and the land manager agreed at the time that we need to do a little bit of wait and see to justify the need to do any type of restricting in terms of access. So I would encourage you to take a similar approach to say, let's wait and see, let's do this on a trial basis, or consider this a pilot project. Let's do this for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever the period is. And see what we need to do moving forward to keep that line of communication open, that access to that experience open, and make sure it works for everybody. That would be my advice.
Excellent. Great. All right, the next question. I know conditions may vary, but what is recommended distance between resting/recharge areas?
Yep. So there are minimum recommendations in, again, that handout that I mentioned that's on Mid-Atlantic's website. And Emily, I don't know if you could drop a link to that.
I did. Yep.
Excellent.
It's in the
Thank
chat
you.
bar.
Yep. So that it does depend on a number of other factors as well. If all is perfect and slopes are perfect and everything like that, you can generally go for 200 feet on an accessible trail before you need to provide a passing space or a resting space. But that's if every condition is absolutely perfect on that space. I would say a more inclusive approach to that would be put them a little bit closer together, or universally design that trail to be at least 60 inches wider if possible, to negate the need for passing spaces altogether. The more wide the trail gets, the less likely you have to do something, quote, special in terms of design to meet all of the factors that go into providing an accessible trail experience.
Great. And we've got a question from somebody from New Zealand.
Yes.
I know. Now again, this might be something, Michelle, we have to come back to, and maybe something you might not know, but I just want to throw this out here because again, it's from New Zealand. Is there a national state park that you think does a particularly good job of communicating trail accessibility information on their website? I don't know if you've had any experience in reviewing and assessing their websites and you've seen, one that's particularly good versus the others, or this is something that maybe we can throw out there later on.
Yes, actually, I'm going to point you in the direction of the National Park Service. Sequoia and Kings Canyon does a really great job communicating the accessible and inclusive features of their outdoor recreation opportunities on their website through a series of videos as well as written information. So that is nps.gov/SEKI. And you can likely find that information on their the accessibility portion of their website. I'd tell you to start there. There are also several other national parks that do a really good job of communicating information. A couple off the top of my head, Grand Canyon does a pretty good job, as does Golden Gate National Recreation Area. I'm going to leave it at that for now because it's been a minute since I've been to search for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I did post one of them in the chat to get folks started. So,
thank you.
All right. Let's see. Is there a maximum distance length? Let me start over. Is there a maximum distance length of a trail required between turning areas? Should the traveler need to change direction?
That goes to, it's about basically the same thing. A turning area would be the same, considered the same thing as a passing space. So that would be, again, assuming everything's perfect on an accessible trail, the maximum length you could go is 200 feet. But I'd either widen the trail or if possible, or provide those spaces a little bit closer together, just in case of that two-way traffic, or again, somebody doesn't have to backtrack or put themselves in a dangerous position of trying to turn around on a narrow space. Having those passing spaces or turnarounds a little bit closer together might not be a bad idea.
Okay. Great. Let's see. I'm not sure about this one. Have you seen a device called it's basically a basically a two e-bike attached with a seat in between, designed for a person with a mobility disability, but would it meet the legal definition of a wheelchair?
That is a really wonderful question. I have not seen that device specifically, but again, I would refer you to the ADA National Network's resource on wheelchairs and other power-driven mobility devices. Also, ada.gov has a really nice resource on other power-driven mobility devices, clearly defining those assessment factors. So the debate on whether it meets the definition of a wheelchair or an other power-driven mobility device will be very clear by looking at either of those two resources.
This one is regarding making trails more accessible to people who are blind. The person makes a comment that a good start might be trail edge detection. That might make it easier for someone to walk the trail more independently.
That's very true. So edge detection of any type. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in an outdoor environment, doesn't necessarily have to meet the typical dimensions or posted accessible requirements for edge protections per se. But a detectable edge along the trail is a good idea. So whether that means that the trail is bordered by boulders or timbers, or there's just a slight variation in the surface material from the gravel to a natural dirt, for example, or from asphalt to dirt, where those transitions occur, they will be detectable by somebody who is blind or has low vision, particularly users with white canes.
Great. Local jurisdictions seem to interpret the definition of a trail or path differently within a park. If the design intent is a trail, some jurisdictions have required it to be designed to the 2010 standards versus the ABA standards due to their Title II status. When can a path be treated as a trail in this scenario? Or do the 2010 ADA standards always rule?
Okay, so a couple of distinctions. 2010 ADA standards always rule in new construction or alterations for any covered entity, Title II or Title III. The ABA, the 2013 ABA, also applies to new construction or alterations for any federal entity in new construction or alterations. When you're looking at renovating or doing a new project for an accessible trail on, if you are an ADA covered entity, Title II or Title III, your obligation is for access to that experience. So how you do that is likely going to look to 2013 ABA as the guiding standard or guiding principles for trail access. This person who asked the question also makes a really good distinction of, it's a good idea to follow the money or follow the contract language when you're receiving funds, any type of funds to do outdoor recreation design planning. Pay attention to your contract language. If it cites specific standards that project is held to because of the source of the funding or what have you, pay attention to that and follow those standards. So that's a good question. If there's ever a question on what standards apply to a particular project, the ADA National Network is a great resource to go to, as well as your state or local ADA coordinators. They can help you find that information.
Great. Excellent. So one last one, let's see if we can squeeze this in here.
Sure.
Another question regarding trail accessibility for individuals who are blind or low vision. Looking for resources. Are you aware of any trails that are fully accessible for people who are blind? I bring this up, Michelle, maybe not something we can answer right away, but I do see several questions about this. So maybe this is something we can post, Michelle, if you have anything about trail accessibility for individuals who are blind or low vision.
Yeah. So trail accessibility for individuals who are blind or low vision, I'll go back to two prevailing principles. One is that idea of edge detectability, right? So having a path surface that is consistent enough along the path of that trail so that a user who is blind or has low vision knows what surface they are meant to stay on, right? So if, for instance, if the surface gets too soft or too rocky, there's a known there that they've deviated a little bit too far from the pathway, right? Providing that objective information, how is that information being conveyed? Going back to the principles of new trail sign design, talking about the slopes, the surface type that is along the trail, how steep it gets, where are the areas to rest? How is that information being conveyed? That's the real question for best meeting the needs of individuals who are blind or have low vision is what information is being provided and how is it being provided, and is it being provided in the most accessible way?
Thank you. So there's been some great comments in the chat. So I'm going to ask our tech moderator, Maynard, if you could make sure we save that chat, and maybe even save the questions so we can get back to folks and make sure we post that information on our website. At a wrap at this point, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us. It was great to have you back. We miss you greatly. And this is some fantastic information that was shared, a lot of great resources, a lot of great information. I put several links in the chat that hopefully everyone could see, but we do have some things. We do have this PowerPoint, a copy of it, and a few handouts posted on our website. but we will try to get some more information. Especially the chat's been great with some great recommendations. So thank you to the participants as well for sharing those resources and information. We'll try to get that shared and posted on our website, let you folks know when that's available. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our captioners, to our ASL interpreters for keeping up with us. Appreciate it. And thank you again, Michelle. We appreciate you and appreciate you coming back for this session and joining us. So, and at 3:01, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.